I really like that you say that you don't agree with the Buddhist, I think it's the Buddhists who say there was never any suffering.
Did I ever say that I didn't agree with that?
I'm sure you did.
Did I? Okay.
Okay, well, you've just cancelled my question.
No. Just remind me what I said,
Okay,
that I don't agree with the...
The statement that there was never any suffering because there was never anybody to suffer. Do you agree with that or not?
Yes and no.
That's my question, because
Okay.
when you say that King Lear never existed, it seems to me you're saying exactly the same thing.
Yes. One has to be very careful making a statement like this. So I may have said, and it's important not to take what I say out of context. I always try to provide the context for what I say, but sometimes I don't provide the context. I rely on people's understanding. So it is possible that at some time in the past, in response to someone's question, which I may have intuited was founded rather superficially on the belief there's nobody here, there's nothing to do, there's no one to suffer. In order to push that person a little deeper and more honestly into their experience, I may have said, no, get real. You suffer. People suffer. So in that case, I would not be agreeing with the Buddhist statement, there is no suffering, there is no one to suffer. But it's only in a particular context that I would have said that. The next day someone may ask a question, and in their question they may give a long story as to why they are suffering. And I might say to them, well, instead of being involved with the story, the apparent cause of your suffering, or even your suffering itself, investigate the person who suffers, the I that is lonely, sad, ashamed, unlovable, guilty, etc. And if you look for that I, that limited, temporary, finite center of consciousness, you'll never find it. So, in other words, that there is no, once we understand and feel that there is no separate self, that the separate self is only a temporary limitation, a temporary and ultimately illusory limitation of the true and only self of infinite, unconditionally happy awareness, then we can say there is no suffering and there is no one to suffer. So these two statements, there is suffering and our suffering is very real, and the statement, there is no suffering and the person who suffers is illusory, is also true. They're both true. I'm not allowed to use the analogy of John Smith and King Lear anymore, so so I have to say that the first statement, that there is suffering and there is someone who suffers, is true of the policeman. The second statement, there is no suffering for there is nobody to suffer, is true of the naked man. So it depends on whose behalf we are speaking. Both statements are true. Does that answer your question? Not quite.
Yeah, it answers the question. It's just there's something in me always rebels against that because, of course, we see so much unspeakable suffering in the world and, it's there. There is suffering happening.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, as people, we suffer undeniably, and it would be facile to deny that.
That's it. Yeah.
And that's why I would never, that I don't just automatically answer every question about suffering with, well, there's no suffering because there's no person to suffer. That sounds like the non-dual teaching. But if that answer is just given mechanically to every question about suffering, it betrays the fact that the teaching is not really coming from understanding. It's just coming from a series of non-dual concepts that have been learned in satsang or on YouTube or in a book. That's not the real non-dual teaching. The non-dual teaching is free from any prescription to any set of ideas, and will one moment say, yes, there is suffering. Your suffering is very real. And 5 minutes later may say, no, there is ultimately no suffering, because the one who suffers is not who he thinks he really is. So I think one has to be very cautious, particularly in these days when the teaching no longer takes place as it used to 100 years ago or 200 years ago, in closed communities, small closed communities that grow up around the teacher, where most of the people are long-term students or devotees. So there is a kind of, it's not necessary to build the teaching up from scratch in relation to every answer, because the small group around the teaching, they already have the basics, so the teaching doesn't need to go pedantically through every step. Things are different now. A teacher says something, and 10 minutes later it's on YouTube, available to millions of people. So I feel that a teacher has to move with the times and be responsible, to understand that things are different now. If one makes a statement like that, one has to qualify it.
Yeah. It seems to me when you just said now, the one who suffers is not who he or she thinks he or she is. Yeah, that's different than saying there's nobody to suffer.
That's right.
That's the nuance.
Yes, you see, you're absolutely right. We often hear on the Neo Advaita circuit a statement such as, there's nobody here. There's nothing here. This is, of course, nonsense.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to explain. Because this is precisely one of those statements that if it went out onto YouTube without being explained, could give the wrong impression. So I now have to explain what I mean by that. Let's say the one who says there is nobody here is called now I have to be really careful. I have to think of a name that doesn't relate to anybody that I know or have ever heard of. Help me out. Ollie. I don't know anyone called Ollie, thank you. Okay, well, let's say that someone here called Ollie is a Neo Advaita teacher and gives meetings, and that the basic message is there's nobody here and there's nothing to do. So that's fine. We carry on with our conversation here, and then halfway through the meeting, at the back of the room, Naya walks in to the room and says, sorry to disturb you all, but is anyone called Ollie here? Ollie puts up his hand. Now, why does Ollie put up his hand and none of the rest of us? if there was nothing there that related to the word Ollie, Ollie would not put his hand up. But Ollie does put his hand up, and none of us put our hands up. There is something there to which the word Ollie refers, and it is in that person's experience alone. So if Ollie then deals with the emergency, comes back, starts talking with his friends, and just says, "There's nobody here," it's nonsense. It's true that what is essential to the person Ollie, what Ollie considers to be himself, it is not limited by the thoughts, the feelings, the activities and relationships that pertain to that particular body-mind. But nevertheless, there is a self, if we can call it a self. There is something that Ollie refers to when he says I. Now, Ollie, this I, the self of Ollie, may recognize that it has no limits, and therefore it is not limited to the body and the mind of Ollie. But nevertheless, there is something there that says yes when his name is called. What is it that says, when you hear the name Ollie, he says, yes, I am here? What is it that says that? It is consciousness. That is what is really there. Even when Ollie says, Ollie the Neo Advaita says, there is nobody here. What does he mean by the word here? When he says here, he means this location. Well, that's what the separate self is, a location of consciousness. So to say there is nobody here is a contradiction of terms. If there was nobody, there would be no here. There would be nothing located here. So to say there is nobody here is simply a contradiction of terms. There is something or someone that seems to be located here, and that is what we call our self. And our self seems to be located in, and as a result, to share the limits and the destiny of this body. So if we make a deep investigation of that self, we find that none of the limits of our thoughts and perceptions actually pertain to that self. So there is something which is not a thing that is present, and it is essentially unlimited, and it is the self of all selves. But nevertheless, it is apparently located here, for as long as we are embodied. So we have to be very careful making statements such as, there is no suffering, there's nobody here, there's nothing to do. They seem to be non-dual statements, and they can be statements of the ultimate truth, as far as it is possible to make a statement of the ultimate truth. But I feel one should be very cautious saying such things, especially nowadays when anything that anybody says is shared so rapidly in the media, where people don't have the context or the understanding with which to fully understand these statements, and therefore they are nearly always mistaken. And this brings the non-dual teaching into disrepute and dumbs it down. And